everyone! Welcome to my virtual book launch for The Silence of Stones. We're going to do a little quick and dirty history of the background for my book, so let's get started. The Silence of Stones is the 8th book in the Crispin Guest medieval mystery series. As some of you know, Crispin Guest is a disgraced knight turned detective on the mean streets of 14th century London. Crispin is a fascinating hero, a medieval gumshoe with a dark and stormy past, who doesn't always play by the rules. Though he no longer holds a title, he has a good heart and a dry sense of humor. He surrounded himself with a motley crew of priests and peasants, like his servant, the lovable young thief Jack Tucker. Trapped somewhere between his old life in the king's court and his new life as the tracker, Crispin struggles to survive, but not at the cost of what he holds dearest, his honor. In The Silence of Stones, the mythical Stone of Destiny is stolen from the throne of England in Westminster Abbey, and Crispin witnesses the dramatic disappearance for himself. After the disastrous civil strife of the last 2 years, he knows well that King Richard II now fears that the populace will take it as a sign to side with Richard's rebellious barons. The king can little afford for his authority to be any more undermined, especially after the English army suffers a crushing defeat against a Scottish uprising. Desperate, Richard turns to Crispin to find the missing stone, and to ensure that he will do the deed, the king imprisons Jack Tucker and orders Crispin to find the stone before Parliament convenes in 3 days' time, or Jack will hang for treason. Pretty good, huh? So let us venture back, across the sea, across time itself, and land in Scotland. Beautiful, isn't it? Miles of stunning countryside, mountains, lovely valleys, and Hogwarts. Because of its remoteness from England, Scotland has always been distinct, creating its own wonderful and diverse culture. Let's look at a little of that. Here's a map of Scotland by Matthew Paris from 1250. It's just a little off. A good try. Looks like we got in Hadrian's Wall to keep the Scots in Scotland. An interesting look at the medieval impression of the era. And some heroes from Scotland's past, which are peripheral to our story. On the left is Robert the Bruce, and on the right, William Wallace from Braveheart fame. Both fought to get rid of the English from Scotland. The late 1200s were a confusing time in Scotland. All the heirs to the Scottish throne seemed to be dying off, one after the other. At one time there were 14 claimants to the throne, but mostly it fell between John Balliol and Robert the Bruce. The Scots asked King Edward I of England, as a noble and regal gentleman, to arbitrate their dispute. They thought he might be just the ticket to swan in, help them decide, and then swan out again. Little did they know. This is King Edward I, Longshanks, because he was very tall, also later called Hammer of the Scots. He was the great-great-grandfather of Richard II, the king who reigns during the Crispin books. Now Edward said, "Sure, I'll arbitrate, but if I do this for you, you name me Overlord of Scotland." They kind of rolled their eyes, said, "Sure, whatevs." Then the Scots ended up choosing John Balliol anyway. Edward, it just wouldn't seem to go away. He's like the last guy to leave the party, even when the hosts are starting to clean up. So he asked the Scots to provide troops for his war with France, and they're like, "Are you still here?" So they're so pissed off, in fact, that they allied themselves with France. Now Edward is pissed off, and in 1296 he invades Scotland, and that's when he captures the Stone of Destiny. So, what is the Stone of Destiny? The Stone of Scone, Jacob's pillow. Well, back in Genesis 28, Jacob travels to Bethel, gets tired, grabs a stone, as one does, and uses it as a pillow, and dreams of a stairway to heaven. And it is this stone that is taken into Egypt by Jacob's sons. The pharaoh's daughter named Scota, where people believe the name of Scotland derived, except it didn't because it comes from Latin, Scoti, which means the Gaelic regions, supposedly took the stone into Spain, and then it ended up somehow in Ireland where Irish kings were crowned. It seemed to be the thing to do to sit on the stone and be crowned. In Ireland, the stone was supposed to groan if you had the right to be king when you sat on it, and stay silent if you didn't. That would mean a lot of instances where no one was king. Until the smart guy hid someone in the bushes to groan at the appropriate time, and if that were the case, he deserves to be king. In the 6th century, and I'm gonna screw up the pronunciation of this name, so forgive me, Fergus Mór mac Irca, king of the Picts, brought it to Scotland. Here's another name. Sinead mac Elpin, first king of the Scots, left it at Scone Abbey. It's grey sandstone, 27 inches long, 17 inches wide, and 11 inches high, with iron rings embedded on either side. It's stolen in my book, but it was never stolen until young Scottish nationalists stole it in 1950. In 1996, Prime Minister John Major returned it to Scotland to appease the Scottish independence movement. So now the stone lives in Edinburgh Castle with the proviso that it come back to England when a new monarch needs to be crowned. Tests done on the stone in 1996 proved that the stone's provenance was around Scone Abbey. So much for Bethel and Egypt and Spain. However, did the monks of Scone Abbey pull a fast one? Did they give Edward the real stone? Rumor had it that they hid the stone and gave Edward a lid to a cesspit, with rings and all. Even Edward wasn't sure, and he returned to Scone to demand an answer. But everyone said that, oh yes, that's the real stone. So, is it the real stone of destiny? Is the real stone still hidden somewhere in the abbey or in the hills? No one will ever likely know. All this talk of the stone naturally leads us to the coronation chair. Now, this is not a throne. This chair was strictly created for the purpose of crowning the monarch of England. Edward originally commissioned a bronze chair, and it was always designed to house the Stone of Destiny beneath the seat, as the symbol of England's supremacy over Scotland. But the bronze chair was going to be far too expensive, so he settled for one of wood. It is believed Edward II, Edward III, and Richard II were crowned sitting in this chair, but we aren't certain. The first monarch we are sure of that sat in the coronation chair for his crown was Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV. This is how it looks today without the stone under the seat. Which brings us to Westminster Abbey. This is the view of the north transept, the picture that you see on the cover of the Dew book. The church was founded in the 7th century, was called Thornay. The A is for Ayot, a small island on the Thames. The Thames used to flow around this bit of land called Thorn Island. King Offa described it as a terrible place, literally full of thorny vegetation. In 960, St. Dunstan founded a Benedictine monastery there. Early tradition had it that a fisherman saw a vision of St. Peter nearby, so the church was called St. Peter's. And it was also on the fishmonger's company to provide a salmon to the monastery every year because of this. And the fishmonger's company still bestows a salmon every year. The present church was begun in 1245 by King Henry III, and it cost him £45,000. It is really called the Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster, but that's a lot to put on a business card, so most people just call it Westminster Abbey. In 1540, the status of the church was changed to a cathedral, but after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, it is no longer a cathedral or a monastery. So technically, it isn't really an abbey any longer. Instead, it's a royal peculiar, which means that the church answers only to the monarch. Nicholas de Lidlington was the abbot of Westminster Abbey in Crispin's day, and he was a good friend to Crispin. And this is his crest. See the NL? This is an breviary, a prayer book. During his time as abbot, he did a lot of renovation and redesign of the church. Churches weren't static then. After a while, styles went out of fashion, just as they do today, and they're reworked and redesigned. Such was the case for Westminster Abbey, Westminster Hall, and Canterbury Cathedral, to name but a few. These are the Purbeck marble columns in the nave that Abbot Nicholas installed. This is the west door entrance, or the western facade. And here is the floor plan. Here is the north door, again, that you see in the book, right there on the book cover. This is the west transept door that we just saw. Here is the nave, running down the middle. And this is the choir, where the monks chanted their daily office. And way over here is the sanctuary, where the priest consecrates the host for communion. So you see, right here at the crossing, that's the place the king and his special retinue would be seated, so they were right up front. Meanwhile, the rabble, where you and I would be, is way back here in the nave, standing. There were no pews back then. And here is the tomb, right there, of Edward the Confessor. Here's the tomb again. Edward the Confessor was the king who had no heir and had promised the throne to the Duke of Normandy, also known as William the Bastard, who had to cross the Channel and come to England in 1066 to grab the throne back from Harold Godwinson to become William the Conqueror. Here is where the coronation chair is usually stored. Or at least it used to be. Symbols. They can hold people together or divide them. The stone in the coronation chair was designed to cleave England and Scotland together, but really only served to divide. The medieval world was chock full of symbols of royalty and nobility, of the divine and the humble. Castles, cathedrals, crowns, badges of office. Crispin's sword is the symbol not only of his past, but yes, of virility, an important aspect of the medieval man's place in society. It's the symbols that fascinate us about this period. That's what draws us back again and again, and it's what I hope draws you to the Crispin books. I want to thank you all for joining me today to launch my newest book, The Silence of Stones. Please feel free to hang around for questions, discussions, and prizes.